Good morning, everyone. My name is Riccardo Crescenzi. I am a professor of economic geography at the LSE, and I will be your host for this session. It is a great pleasure to welcome you to this plenary session on foreign direct investment and global value chain in a changing geopolitical environment. And it is, for me, an honor and a pleasure to welcome our distinguished speakers. Professor Beata Javorcik of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and Bruno Casella of the UNCTAD. Let me briefly introduce our speakers. Beata is the chief economist of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. She's currently on leave from the University of Oxford, where she's the first woman to hold a statutory professorship in economics. She's also a fellow of the All Souls College, Oxford, and the director of the International Trade Programme and the Centre for Economic Policy Research in London. Before taking up her position in Oxford, she worked at the World Bank, where she focused on research, lending operations, and policy advice. She holds a PhD in economics from Yale and a BA in economics from the University of Rochester. Dr. Bruno Casella is a senior economist at the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, where he leads the Intellectual Property and Development Unit. At UNCTAD, Bruno has been leading economic and policy research on various themes: investment and international taxation, global value chains and development, Industry 4.0. Bruno has published extensively in academic journals and in specialized reports and books, mainstreaming new analytical approaches and policy recommendations in the areas of international business and economics. Prior to joining UNCTAD, he was at strategic consulting firms McKinsey. Bruno holds a PhD in statistics and a degree in economics from Bocconi University. So it's a great pleasure to welcome these two leading experts on the subject. And in their talk, Beata and then Bruno will bring us at the very center of the most recent scholarly and policy debates on the ongoing reconfiguration of trade flows, foreign direct investment, and global value chains. The idea is that growing geopolitical tensions, increased systemic risks, as well as the demands for inputs and critical materials to support the green transition have called into question the consolidated internationalization patterns of virtually all economies. These presents opportunities as well as challenges for economies across the globe. And regional analysis cannot overlook this phenomenon, whose effects have profound implications for people and places on the ground. One key objective of this plenary session is indeed to raise the awareness of our regional studies community on the nature and implications of these important global issues and foster further reflections in terms of both local and regional economic analysis as well as local and regional policies. That is very much the business and the core area of focus of our community as well as our journals. In this area of inquiry, the regional studies community is uniquely placed to shed new light, for example, on the spatial unevenness and the geographical implications of changing global connectivity patterns. Our community can offer important new insights on local and regional policies for sustainable economic development in a changing global economic environment. So I really do hope that this will be an opportunity for discussion and interaction also across different disciplines and across approaches, more global, more local, joined together. So the event is going to be organized following this part-to-part introduction. There will be a first round of talks by our speakers, Beata first and then Bruno, and then we will have a Q&A session with questions from the audience. So I will leave immediately the floor to Beata for a talk. Thank you very much.
Well, good morning. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be joining you today. We live in turbulent times. We live in times of globalization being reversed. And globalization is being reversed through policy shocks. The most prominent of those shocks is the US-China trade war, the restrictions on technology flows between the two economies. There was also Brexit. There are sanctions on Russia, which have changed trade flows around Central Asia, Caucasus, and Russia. And there is the European strategic autonomy approach, which is also moving in the directions of greater restrictions. And I think it's fair to say that the world is embarking on a path to fragmentation. So what I want to do in this very short presentation is to think about some of the implications of these changes. And I'm going to focus on three things. First, I'm going to look at the US-China trade war, and in particular at the increase in tariffs on goods. And I will ask whether this policy shock has improved opportunities for American workers, which was the stated policy goal. Then I'm going to switch and consider services in the context of the Brexit referendum. And I will try to convince you that anticipation of barriers to services trade had visible impacts on outcomes in the UK. And then I'm going to zoom out to the global level and argue that fragmentation, if it happens, is going to be a costly and risky path. Now, each of these points is based on research, in the first two cases on academic papers, but of course I don't have time to give you the details. I will just give you some highlights and some flavor of what these papers do. So starting with the US-China trade war, the question is, did the 2018 tariff increases lead to more opportunities for American workers? Now, US has been a country that has been probably the most dissatisfied with globalization. That is due to manufacturing jobs disappearing, to some extent due to the China shock, to a large extent due to technological progress. And this dissatisfaction has been captured by President Trump when in his inaugural address, he talked about one by one factories closing down and leaving the US shores, and leaving without even sparing a thought about millions and millions of American workers left behind. Now, President Trump promised to do something about this, and already, in the second year of his presidency, he introduced tariffs on China, as well as tariffs on other US trading partners. Now, the tariffs on China were on the order of 20-25%. Together, all of these tariffs introduced by Trump administration covered 12,000 products, different products, and 300 billion of US imports. Now, of course, the world did not just stand still. US trading partners responded by retaliating with their own tariffs, and in particular, China did that. So what we do in this paper is we look at commuting zones in the US, 320 of them, and we look at what was happening to the online job postings in those commuting zones. We use data from Burning Glass Technologies, which scrapes more than 40,000 various bulletin boards. And then we combine this information with data on tariff increases, with employment composition by the commuting zone. And we do something very simple. For each sector, to each manufacturing sector, we link products that are produced by this sector. And we know the pre-trade war composition of US imports. We know the tariffs that were introduced by the Trump administration. So we calculate the total tariff bill per worker employed in a given US manufacturing industry. Right? So that gives us a measure that is at the level of a manufacturing sector and varies by time. And then we do the same thing for tariffs on inputs. We calculate the tariff burden per worker employed in a given industry. So this is the burden on inputs that are used by that sector. And then we do the same thing for retaliatory tariffs, so tariff on US exports. And then, to bring it to the level of the commuting zone, we take the pre-shock employment structure in that commuting zone in the US, and we use it to weigh the tariff burden. So in other words, we create a location-specific, time-varying exposure to those tariffs. Tariffs on output, tariffs on input, and tariffs on exports. And as you can see on those maps, there is a lot of variation across the US in terms of those tariffs. And each of those little areas corresponds to a commuting zone with darker areas suggesting higher exposure. And then what we do is for each commuting zone, we have information on tariffs, on number of jobs posted in a month, in a given month. So our job posting data captures the first day when a job is being posted. We remove duplicates, so it's only each job, even if it's posted on multiple sites, it's counted only once. And then we ask, is there a correlation between the number of online job postings in a given locality and the exposure of that locality to the policy shock? And what we find is, indeed, the two things are linked. The greater the exposure of the locality to the burden associated with input tariffs, so basically the higher the cost of doing business because of the tariffs you have to pay on your inputs, which make inputs more expensive, the lower the number of online job postings. And then we see that the higher the tariff on exports of that locality, the lower the number of job postings. And in this regression, we have fixed effects, so the postings are at the location month level. We have fixed effects for each location and for each time period. How big are these effects? Well, they are actually non-negligible. If you do a back of the envelope calculation, you find that we see that about 175,000 jobs were not posted, and they would have been posted had there been no tariffs. We find that this effect worked through the tariffs on inputs as well as tariff on exports. We find no robust effect of import protection. So in other words, tariffs on output that were supposed to protect American workers don't have a robust positive effect as promised by President Trump. Moreover, the jobs that are being affected are primarily the low-skilled jobs, as you would expect, since these are manufacturing jobs. Okay, so these were tariffs on inputs. Now let's move away from trade in goods to trade in services, and let's look at the Brexit referendum and anticipation of changes to trade barriers that it introduced. So the specific question we ask here is how the threat of the UK exports of services facing barriers in the European Union, how did this threat translate into job opportunities for workers at the level of travel to work area in the UK? We look at 218 travel to work areas. We exclude Northern Ireland because of sort of other issues that it was facing. And it's the same source of data, online job postings. Now, I don't think I have to remind you of the timeline of the Brexit referendum, but just in case you forgot, the referendum took place in June 2016. Then not much happened for about 9 months until in March of the subsequent year, Theresa May's government invoked Article 50, formally notifying the EU of the intention of the UK to leave the Union. And it wasn't until a year later, more than a year later, that the UK government articulated its negotiating strategy in that. And yeah, the rest is history. Now, these dates are highlighted here because they are going to matter for our argument. So, how do we capture the barriers to UK export of services? So here we are going to work with anticipated barriers, right? So luckily for us, OECD produces an index of services trade restrictiveness. This index is done at the level of countries and sectors within countries. And when it comes to the EU, this index comes in two flavors. It captures barriers to trade in services coming from other EU members versus coming from third countries, in this case, the WTO members. This is what we call MFN, the most favored nation index. So where are these barriers high? So if you look at the top of this graph, Poland imposes big barriers to trade in services in legal industry. There are barriers on equity investment. You may have to take an exam. The index goes from 0 to 1. So in the case of legal services in Poland, the value is 0.8. These are the barriers against WTO members. However, when you look at barriers against other members of the EU, this is the second column, these barriers are much smaller. So what we look at is the difference between the two. How different is the treatment of the EU member states, or more precisely the European Economic Area members, versus WTO members? And this difference is the anticipated increase in the barriers to services trade that was likely to affect the UK. And then we do it for each country and each industry. We look at this difference. And then for each services industry, we calculate the average anticipated increase in barriers across all EU countries. Then we also take into account how tradable each services industry is by looking at export per UK worker employed in that industry. And all of this information comes from the pre-referendum period. And then we do the same trick as in the previous paper. To bring it to the level of travel to work area, we look at the composition of employment in a given travel to work area, and we say, well, if this locality has a large share of employment in services, and in particularly in services which are likely to face higher barriers, this locality has a greater exposure to the shock. Now, your prior probably is that London is the most exposed. That's actually not the case. Edinburgh tops the list, followed by Halifax, Trowbridge, Swindon. London is only in position 6, and you see across the UK map that there is a lot of difference across localities. Then what we do the same thing for trade in goods. We also take into account potential restrictions on migration, so we look at the dependence on each locality on migrant workers from the EU. And then we ask, is there a relationship between the number of job postings in a given locality and exposure to barriers to services exports? And we do it in the form of an event study, controlling for exposure to barriers in trading goods, migration, changes in exchange. Right? And our data is at the level of month, or we do it at this, but to smooth things, our event study has quarterly granularity. The omitted periods are the first two periods, quarter 1 and 2 of 2015. The red line is the Brexit referendum time. So what you see is there is no difference in key trends. Referendum happens, there is no response to online job postings, to how a given locality is exposed to the shock. The first effect you see happens around the time when the government invokes Article 50, where the EU is formally notified of the intention to leave the Union. Then the second shock happens around here. This is the time when the government publishes the white paper, which says, we want to seek a free trade area for goods, but a looser relationship in services. We want to chart our own path, meaning regulatory divergence, right? And that's where you see these online postings reacting. And as this white paper was published, the Financial Times article called it a real blow for the UK's financial and related professional services sector. So what we show in this paper is that the threat of barriers to services that was introduced by the Brexit referendum was reflected in the lower number of online job postings. The postings that were not taking place were postings for good jobs, skilled jobs, professional jobs, managerial jobs, high-paying jobs. Now, zooming out to the global level, if the world were to find itself in a fragmented situation, so if the world were to break into two blocks, what would happen? Well, we asked this question in a background paper we prepared for our flagship report, Transition Report. And we said, take the voting pattern at the UN on condemning Russian attack on Ukraine, and let's assume that all the countries that voted to condemn the attack are in one block, everybody else in another block, and then the trade costs between these two blocks go up by 20%, or tariffs go up by 20%. Now, you can split these blocks slightly differently. You can allow for sort of countries non-aligned. What's the message? The message is that pretty much everybody loses, and here you see the welfare losses. In particular, we focus on EBRD's countries of operations, hence the choice of countries. And among our countries, Morocco and Kazakhstan were the biggest losers, and that is because they have links to economies that would find themselves in the opposing blocks. Right? So the message is, if fragmentation becomes reality, yes, maybe it will produce some insurance against shocks, as its proponents argue, but this insurance will come at an overall welfare cost. But there is another aspect to green transition, to fragmentation that few people talk about. And this aspect is related to green transition. So this is a figure taken from the International Energy Agency, which shows that green transition will require increased inputs of certain minerals and metals. So for instance, if you compare conventional car to electric car requires 5 times as many minerals. So in particular, this would be copper, and the red thing, this would be graphite. Now, generation of renewable energy is also intensive in minerals, and for instance, offshore wind turbines require rare earth. These are very powerful magnets that are needed there, as well as many other minerals. So the question is, who has these minerals? So in our forthcoming transition report, again, we assumed that the world is split into two blocks. Here, we used a slightly different definition. We looked at a longer-term similarity in the patterns of voting at the UN, and we said, here's the Western Bloc, and here's everybody else. And then we looked at global mineral reserves, which are located in one block versus another block. Western bloc is in these are the dark blue lines. The other block is the pink one. In some cases, we don't have full information on the location of the reserves, and that's why not every bar adds up to 100%. Now, what do you see? Think about graphite. Remember, graphite was needed for electric cars. Well, it's 2/3 of reserves are in the non-Western bloc. Why is graphite significant? Because 2 weeks ago, China announced restrictions on exports of graphite. So these are all minerals needed for green technologies. As you can see, chromium is another example where the Western bloc has holding very few reserves. These are other critical minerals. These are taken from the EU and US list of critical minerals. Look at the rare earth. Remember, these are the things that are needed for offshore wind turbines. More than 90% of reserves are in the other block, right? And then, there are currently 30% of critical products, critical inputs, are under some form of export restrictions. And this is as of actually last year, that doesn't even include graphite or germanium and gallium, on which restrictions were introduced earlier this year. So what I'm arguing is that the world is on a path to fragmentation. This fragmentation will be costly in terms of welfare. And moreover, this fragmentation may be detrimental to green transition if there is a proliferation of export restrictions. Because many of those export restrictions were introduced by China in retaliation for the introduction of the US CHIPS Act that restricted ability of firms benefiting from US subsidies to export technology to China. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a lovely talk. It was incredibly topical and really went into the direction of linking this global phenomena with local impacts and what happens on the ground. So thank you very much. Without any further ado, I will leave the floor to Bruno Casella for his talk.
Yes, thank you, Riccardo. I apologize. I will make my speech from here because I have a little bit of headache, and the sitting position helps me. So, first of all, I would like to thank the Regional Study Association and Professor Crescenzi for inviting me here. It's a big honor for me to share the stage with two FDI gurus like Beata and Riccardo. So I must admit that I have a special connection with the topic of GVC and FDI because it's been my first engagement since I moved from the private sector to UNCTAD. It was 10 years ago, back in 2013. And it was for the preparation of our flagship World Investment Report with a title that I still find brilliant in its simplicity, and it was Global Value Chain, International Trade and Investment for Development. And of course, since then, there has been many other reports, and I've been following and leading divisional research work in several areas, some of them very topical, like FDI in international taxation, investment in sustainable development goals. More recently, I've been involved in investment in healthcare. But I can say, without a second of hesitation, that GVC and FDI has been consistently, since 2013, across the last 10 years, and by far, the topic that has catalyzed more attention from policymakers especially from developing countries. Since 2013, when we published the report, it's been almost an uninterrupted stream of requests of follow-up, clarifications, updates, further contributions, policy advisory. Now the question is, why is that? And they think that the answer is, again, back to the title of that report, Global Value Chains, Trade and Investment for Development. If you think about it, it's a very promising agenda for a policymaker, a very powerful value proposition. It's the levels of international trade, investment, and development, the holy trinity of economic growth, are embedded in the analysis of global value chains. So that's why this topic has attracted and continues to attract consistently a lot of interest from policymakers. And for how the current the framework of the current framework of globalization is, global value chains are really the underlying structures shaping a large part of international investment and international trade, shaping their pattern and their mutual interaction. And patterns and mutual interaction of international trade and investment, they play a big part in development pattern prospects, especially of poor countries. Now, to just give you an idea of what we're talking about, I want to show you this figure. This is an analysis that we did back then in 2013. So it shows that 80% of international trade occurs within the global production network of multinational enterprises. Now, what are these global production networks? These global production networks are nothing else than the global value chains that are coordinated by multinational enterprises, including through FDI, but also through non-equity modes, and including through arm's length relationship. So this figure shows, I think it's an idea of how much expansion of global value chain has really pushed the boundaries of international trade and investment, and also stretched their areas of overlapping. So this picture, I think if we take this picture now, it wouldn't be too different. This is the heritage of a period of hyper expansion of globalization and global value chains. But more recently, in the last 4 or 5 years, there has been a growing concern among policymakers that this GVC intensive model that has produced these numbers is, if not at the dawn, definitely on a waning phase. So the focus of policymakers in the last 5 years, I would say, and much more after COVID and the geopolitical tensions, has been on the transition. So what's going to happen now? What are the direction of transformation of international production if this model is expected to play a much smaller role in international production? And at the same time, the second set of questions, what do these changes imply for countries and regions, in particular for developing countries, given their current positioning and role in global value chains, their competitive advantage in international trade and investment, and their level of development. So in the rest of my presentation, I want to focus on these two elements. On the one side, on the transition, so what we can already see in the numbers in terms of this transition, what we can envision, and what we can imagine using a kind of degree of speculation. And on the other side, what this transformation implies in terms of challenges and opportunities for developing countries. And I would like, in particular, to emphasize the opportunities, because against all odds, we will see that there is plenty of opportunity in this transition, even for the poor countries. So, to see what is happening, I would start with the most simple possible picture. So this is a trend of the main indicator of international integration, trade. That's the orange line. Okay, so this is a picture of the trend in the main indicators of international production integration along basically 3 decades, since 1990. So we see there is FDI, in the line trend, which is a re-elaboration of the FDI trend where we get rid of a lot of volatility to capture really the underlying patterns of FDI, it's a technicality. Then there is trade, then there is global value chain. So this is a foreign share in total value added. It's a typical indicator, that is simple but typical indicator that we use for global value chains. And then we have, I think, also GDP. So what we see here is that there are clearly 2 periods. So the first 2 decades, from 1990 to 2010, has seen almost a unidirectional route of travel. So more international production, more global value chain, more investment, more trade. And these 4 things were mutually reinforcing. And the story is quite well known. Unbundling, meaning the fragmentation of tasks, offshoring, the geographical distribution of tasks to capture cost arbitrage, and outsourcing, so a flexible governance of international production network. So these 3 things were the powerful mix that pushed the expansion of global value chain and led them to play a dominant role in international trade and investment, and spurred a phase of hyper globalization. But then, it's, as you see from this picture, from 2010, things start changing. All the indicators of economic integration, they start slowing down. So we have a slowing down of globalization. I think that globalization is an appropriate catchword here. Actually, FDI is slowing down more than trade, for example, because trade keeps the pace of GDP. But there is a stagnation in these indicators. And the first element that we need to notice is that this is all happening before COVID. It's all happening before COVID and before the geopolitical crisis. So this is not conjunctural or generated by exogenous shock. This is structural. And why this is happening? It's happening because the same level that in the first 2 decades have generated an acceleration in international production, global value chain, turned from accelerators to brakes. So the first one, the policy dimension, Beata was illustrating this very clearly. Restrictive policy trade, when it comes to global value chain, they have an impact, of course, on international investment. In addition to that, even in investment policy, we have observed an increase of restrictive policies. So in the half 2000, on 100 new investment policy, 95% were going towards liberalization. Now, in the last 10 years, Still, the number of policies of new policies that goes toward liberalization is prevalent, but it's 75%, meaning that 25% of the new investment policies, quite consistent across the last years, are towards restrictions. So that shows a shift in the policy attitude towards global investment. Second, economic factors. The rate investing offshore has become less convenient than it used to be 30 years ago. The rate of return on FDI has decreased from 9% in the beginning of the 2000s to 6% in the last years. So it's decreased 30%, meaning that those cost advantage in terms of labor cost differential are not there anymore. At least they are not there anymore to the same extent. And also some tax arbitrage that multinational enterprises were benefiting from, they are not there anymore because we know that there is a much stronger scrutiny right now. So the economic level is also less powerful than it used to be. And finally, technology that has pushed the expansion of global value chain. We all know the narrative, for example, of gold. We know about the third industrial revolution. So the expansion of value chains that has been enabled by new technology that allowed governance of international production process and the efficient exchange of information. So that same technology is now pointing to a trend toward more asset-light investment. So digitalization allows to operate in foreign markets with less assets. And this has been documented. So this is a trend towards less tangible investment. So these are the three structural trends that have been motivating this globalization between the 2010 and the 2020. And if you think about it, none of this trend is expected to fade away. If nothing else, they will further intensify. So the question here is really, what's going to happen now? So what's going to happen in this decade? In this decade, we will still have this structural trend, and on top of that, we have the shock that has been generated by the COVID and by the geopolitical crisis that can add to those trends. So it's very difficult to say whether this is gonna determine a flex, so a period of deglobalization, or it will be more of the same. If we look at FDI trends in the last few years, in the last 3 or 4 years, it's rather more of the same. So we see that trends of FDI to developing economies have, in particular, they have shown a strong resilience to COVID and also in 2022 to very recent geopolitical crisis. Trends of FDI to developed economies, it's a different story. They tend to go down and to have a lot of volatility. But this is something that we have seen even before. So the short-term impact of the shocks is more in the direction of sort of more of the same and the sort of resilience. But clearly, at the same time, we observe a shift in the priority of the investor. So if in the short term these shocks, they are not affecting FDI so much, in the long term, there is a shift in the priority investor towards resilience and towards geopolitical security. And this can have, in the long term, a sort of depressing effect on FDI. So we have identified 4 trajectories of evolution of GVC and FDI that I will illustrate very quickly, given the time. One is reshoring. It is really to relocate operation domestically or near shore. And this is a full revert from the direction of expansion of GVC, from offshoring to reshoring, from outsourcing to insourcing, from unbundling to rebounding. So this is really a reversal. Diversification is almost the opposite of reshoring. Is the idea that from supply chain resilience perspective, you can leverage global value chain rather than dismantling them in order to create security. And so create alternative and redundancy within global value chain. Regionalization is the application of the same structure that we have of global value chain at the more regional level, and then we have replication, which is a sort of distributed manufacturing close to the point of consumption. It is typically enabled by the new technology like 3D printing and additive manufacturing. So these are the four trajectories we see within this context. There are, and I come to the final chart, there are some big challenges for developing countries, but also some big opportunities. And here I want to indicate, to conclude with a positive twist, 5 main directions of opportunities for developing countries is changing international production landscape. The first one is the diversification of the supply base, so that it can generate resilience-seeking FDI. So the idea that if production starts moving from factory Asia, where it has been very much concentrated, particularly in China, to other low-cost locations, this location can benefit from that. And if you, when you talk with African governments, they really count a lot on this trend. The second, growing consumer demand in developing countries that is gonna push market-seeking FDI. So FDI, so investment that go there to serve those markets. Consolidation of regional value chains. This is a big opportunity for developing regions. And I must say that the developing regions are they are organizing to really capture this opportunity in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America. Increased digitalization on the one side, of course, is a risk because digitalization generates a bigger polarization between where the value added is concentrated, typically in developed economies, and an increased commoditization of the other activities. But at the same time, for example, it allows much more possibility to enter global value chains by small and medium enterprises from developing countries. Let's think about the e-commerce opportunity, for example. And finally, and I want to conclude with this because I think it's a very important point, the sustainability imperative. So we have recently done an analysis that shows that in order to achieve the sustainable development goals by 2030, developing countries need at least additional 4 trillion investment in tangible assets per year. Now, if you think about it, this is a huge challenge, but at the same time, a huge opportunity, because these sustainable development goals are non-negotiable. It's not that we can say we can achieve a little bit of that. So there will be a lot of investment that will need to go in green activity and in SDG sectors. And recently, I conclude, I was giving a talk in Bangkok for the countries in the Asian region, and this is already happening. if you look at the trends in foreign investment in batteries in the ASEAN region, I think it's growing around 30–40% per year for the last 3 or 4 years. This is something that we haven't seen for long, these are numbers that we haven't seen for a long time in FDI. So this is a really big opportunity that was a 4 trillion additional investment per year. And I conclude here, thanks.
Thank you very much, Bruno. I think this is incredibly well linked with what Beata discussed before, and really outlines a very ambitious research agenda also for the community when thinking about opportunities for regions in developing countries that you mentioned. Because these phenomena are not evenly distributed, but there are specific hotspots and hubs within those countries that benefit from these trends at the expenses of others, increasing spatial inequality, geographical inequality within those countries, as well as when we think about advanced economies, OECD countries, these profound transformations have huge implications for the location of economic activity in particular in less developed regions. There are opportunities and challenges also for less developed regions, less advanced regions in Europe, for example. And so this has important implications when we think about things like the future of cohesion policy. So thank you very much. This has been incredibly insightful. Now we have some time for questions from the audience. Please introduce yourself and ask a question. So a question is characterized by its brevity and by a question mark at the end. So please stick to questions so that we also keep ourselves warm in this rather chill environment. Please.
Hi, thank you very much. Jean Boucher from the James Hutton Institute. I just want to, follow up on Bruno's last point, which is sustainability and greening. So I'm imagining a green and brown analysis here. So green investment versus brown investment, and we know Trump also was put a tariff on solar panels, I think, if I remember correctly. So I'm wondering, for both of you, how would you see something changing, to make it a little bit more provocative? During COVID, we had during recessions, we see greenhouse gases dropping a lot, right? And that was, the cost of living, and economically we might panic. But the planet is going, oh, I could breathe a little bit softer here. So how might you this add to your presentation? Thanks.
I suggest we collect questions in groups of 3, also because we are in between to lunch.
Yes, thank you. Martin Dąbrowski, TU. Thanks for very interesting presentations. In Beata's talk, you mentioned mainly challenges and Bruno mentioned some opportunities for developing countries in particular, but I wanted to ask if you would also see, with the kind of growing restrictions on trade, particularly of those critical resources, deglobalization, do you also see some opportunities, also through this kind of regionalization perspective, for the green transition in places like Europe, European countries? Would there be some opportunities there for maybe regionalizing those value chains and thinking through the lens of circular economy, which is quite prominent in the European Green Deal? So is there a window of opportunity that opens therein, in your opinion? Thank you.
One more question, David.
Thank you. Lovely presentation. David Bailey, University of Birmingham. Industrial policy is back on the agenda. We see it with the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, the Green New Deal, relaxed state aid rules, China going through in a big way. So my question in part is, because of that, might we see investment flows replacing trade? So because the US may be attracting, say, Chinese investments making batteries rather than importing Chinese cars. So might that also have an impact?
Who wants to? Yeah.
Sure. So thank you very much for these questions. On opportunities, right? So I sounded very negative, but there are opportunities. So Bruno was mentioning building resilience in global value chains. And that is an opportunity for the broadly defined European neighborhood. So for instance, for the new EU member states, for Western Balkans, for North Africa. as there is a desire to find new suppliers to bring production closer, these countries are hoping to capture some of that business. And recently we did a survey of investment promotion agencies in those countries, and actually vast majority of them say we are targeting investment associated with reshaping of global value chains. Now we also see reshaping of global value chains in the US data. So with co-authors, I looked at transaction level data on US imports. And what you see is that share of China has peaked in US imports. You see that in particular American retailers in the last few years have declined their reliance on China. They shifted, so they increased the share of sourcing they do in Mexico or in Vietnam, and this is looking at the level of an importer and product, right? So this is not sort of broad trade statistics. These are actually within firm statistics. On green versus brown, I think that access to renewable energy will become a determinant of comparative advantage. And you also see in the survey of investment promotion agencies that countries want to attract investment in renewables, and that investment, I believe, can bring manufacturing opportunities. And of course, there are MDBs, like my own institution, EBRD. 50% of our investment a year is to support green transition. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Yeah, I'm very much in line with the Beata points. Linking to investment promotion, so investment promotion agency, maybe you are not so familiar with, these are, for us, for example, in UNCTAD, also for Beata, very important constituencies, because these are the entities that are embedded in the countries and even at the sub-regional level. They are, they have the goal to attract investment and even sometimes to promote outward investment. So, yeah, when we talk to them, we typically say that there are three directions that they have to follow for the next generation of investment promotion, and one is green. The other one is again the building Brazil, playing a role in this reshaping of global value chains from efficiency-seeking FDI to this kind of FDI that I've just illustrated. And the third one is investing a lot in digitalization, because it's going to be a big enabler across the board. So I'm very much in line with what was said by Beata. Just a quick point on the last question. So here I have highlighted the opportunities at the more national or global level, and I was thinking before this presentation if there is some difference in terms of the opportunities that you can capture between the national and the sub-national level. There are not many differences in my view, but I'm not maybe an expert. These are the same. They are more or less the same opportunities. But for example, for market-seeking FDI, and I was discussing before with Beata and Riccardo, there are cities in the developing world that are changing at a pace that is unimaginable. You go from one year, you go the next year, you cannot almost recognize it. They have an incredible demographic trend, and they have a very, very fast-growing middle consuming class. So there is a clear, in my view, it's a clear opportunity at the subnational level. I have in mind because I've been recently in Nairobi, for example. That's a lot of market-seeking FDI, especially in services. And then another opportunity I was thinking about, maybe I'm wrong, it's a provocation. that I open to you is whether within reshoring there is an opportunity to diversify at some national level. So my logic is saying, okay, when I'm reshoring, I'm de facto reconcentrating the operation domestically. And that's not something that I really want from a supply chain resilience perspective. So at the national level, I may want to sort of diversify within the national territory my operation, and maybe this is a direction where the global trends and the subnational trends may, how can I say, may divert. But it's just an idea that I was thinking while preparing this presentation.
Thank you. I think we have time for another round of questions. Martin.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for these presentations. I'm Martin Henning from Gothenburg, Sweden. Just a remark, I think, and so before we invent much of the wheel again, we should also remind ourselves about the work and the different concepts used by Peter Dick in his much influential works on generations of geographers, especially on developmental issues. Well, anyway, the question. I really like the job ads aspect of this, of your presentation. I was wondering, did you compare the job ad results to real outcomes subsequently and those reaching? Question mark.
There is another question.
Yes, thank you very much. Marcello Graziano, Ruralis, Norway, and CCA, University of Connecticut, US. I have a question concerning the link between industrial policies and the green transition, which has been brought up by both of you. You presented about the mining of rare earths, gallium and graphite, for example, but wouldn't the lessons from the past 15 years where China has been doing this game, has been playing this game of restricting, opening, restricting, and opening, maybe taught us a bit to focus on the refining side rather than the extraction. Graphite is, the largest reserves are in Turkey, not in China. Rare earths, not that rare, gallium, germanium, they're byproducts of coal ashes, which we have tons told about. So it's probably now an opportunity for conjugating industrial policy with fostering a transition that is not there, particularly in Europe, where industrial policy means protecting apples, I guess. Thank you.
Thank you. I will ask our speakers for a quick reaction.
So the reason we looked at job ads rather than employment is because they come at high frequency, but there is a study by clients and peers looking at Trump tariffs and sectoral employment, so actual outcomes, and the message is the same. And in the UK context, we looked at sort of fluctuations in unemployment, because these were the data we could get at the travel to work area, and there is some connection, though perhaps not perfect. On refining versus extractions, the figures I showed you come from the transition report, which we are launching on November 21st. There we looked at location of reserves, we looked at ownership of mines, we also looked at production. So not just extraction, but also processing. And for instance, you mentioned gallium and germanium. More than 90% of production is in China, according to the data we have. What is the challenge with increasing production? Is one, getting a permit. A mining permit takes years, and I think if we are serious about securing supply, we need to do something about speeding up the process. And second, a lot of this processing is highly polluting. So for instance, rare earth come with sort of together with radioactive substances. So actually many countries don't want to have this kind of processing in their backyard. And because we have very stringent, in Europe, for instance, environmental regulations, it's not easy to start that production. Industrial policy can help, and in a sense, that's the thinking behind strategic autonomy in Europe, right? How to increase access to those minerals. The question is, will it happen fast enough?
Thank you. Okay, so thank you very much. Our time is up. Let me thank again Beata and Bruno for this engaging and provoking discussion. Thank you all for being here with us today and enjoy your lunch. Thank you very much.